Behind the roaring guitars and chorus hooks that define generations, there's a hidden truth most fans never hear. They were covers, not tributes, not reinterpretations, but full-on reboots of songs that already existed, just in different voices, under different spotlights. These 13 tracks weren't born in stadiums. They started in smoky bars, in overlooked studios, in corners of music history we rarely visit. They were reborn through rock and sometimes became more famous than the originals. What you thought was a beginning was really a transformation. Let's set the record straight. Everyone remembers the moment John Lennon screamed his voice raw on Twist and Shout. That crispy, reckless, electric became one of the Beatles' most iconic recordings. It sounded like the birth of British rock right there in your speakers, with Lennon tearing his throat out over those pounding chords. For millions, that track was the Beatles. But it wasn't born in Liverpool or even England. The song's real roots trace back to 1961, when it was first recorded by the Top Notes. That version barely made a dent. Then came the Isley Brothers, who gave it soul, rhythm, and the fiery call and response dynamic that made it impossible not to move. Their version laid the groundwork, the Beatles just lit the match. And they did it with total urgency. One take, Lennon nearly losing his voice, trying to capture what they'd already perfected in Hamburg's sweaty clubs. The irony is striking. A Black American song, energized by gospel, funk, and rhythm, traveled across the Atlantic to be reborn by 4 white boys in suits, only to come crashing back into American pop culture louder than ever. The Beatles never claimed authorship, but ask anyone on the street, and they'll swear it was theirs. That's how deep this cover carved into rock memory. Twist and Shout isn't just a great song, it's a symbol of how music migrates, transforms, and sometimes gets misremembered. Its true power lies in how it passed through so many hands before landing on a global stage. You didn't just sing along. You inherited a musical legacy without even knowing it. When Elvis Presley performed Hound Dog on national television, it wasn't just a song, it was a cultural earthquake. That hip-shaking, rebellious energy sent shockwaves through polite American society. Parents were horrified. Teenagers were electrified. It was raw, it was dangerous, and it was unforgettable. But Elvis didn't write it. He didn't even record it first. The original belonged to a woman whose name was nearly erased from the spotlight. Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog back in 1952. Her version was explosive in a very different way. With a voice like a freight train and attitude to match, she belted out the song with a fury that could tear through concrete. This wasn't about charming. The Messesset was about calling out a cheating man and reclaiming her power. Her growl was the real thing, and it came from a place of lived experience. The lyrics were written for her by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, 2 young songwriters who understood that Black artists were already shaping the future of music. Thornton's version topped the rhythm and blues charts, but it never reached white mainstream audiences. It took a clean-cut white boy from Memphis to package it for the suburbs, softening the bite, turning it into pop spectacle. Presley's version dropped the anger, added showmanship, and the rest is history. But history has a way of forgetting its foundation. Without Big Mama Thornton, Hound Dog would never have existed in the form we know today. Elvis made it famous, but she made it matter. That growl didn't start in 1956. It started years earlier, with a voice the world nearly left behind. There's a reason every garage band has played Gloria at some point. 3 chords, primal rhythm, shouted lyrics. It's the blueprint for teenage rebellion with a guitar. Van Morrison and his band Them recorded the track in 1964, and suddenly, rebellion had a name. But Morrison didn't chart with it. The version that took over American radios came from another band entirely, The Shadows of Night. The song was born in Belfast clubs, where Van Morrison would stretch it out livesics, even 10 minutes of hypnotic rock and roll ritual. He spelled her name over and over, turning it into a chant, a spell, a manifesto. It was raw, sloppy, and electric. But that rawness was too much for the American market. It took a slicker version leaner, tighter, easier to digest for it to explode across the United States. Shadows of Night recorded their version in 1965, bringing the song into the Billboard Top 10. Their version stripped it down, sharpened the edges, and turned it into a rock radio staple. Most American teens who fell in love with Gloria didn't even know Van Morrison had anything to do with it. To them, it was a new anthem from a band that spoke their language, not a hand-me-down from the other side of the Atlantic. But listen closely, and you'll hear the fingerprints of Morrison's original vision. The fire, the repetition, the messy brilliance's all still there, just dressed up for a different crowd. Gloria wasn't just a song, it was a rite of passage. And like all rites, its origins were far older than most ever realized. By the time I Fought the Law hit the airwaves in 1966, it had already become a teenage battle cry. The Bobby Fuller Four gave it a relentless rhythm, a sing-along chorus, and the voice of a rebel on the run. It felt urgent, dangerous, Taylor, made for a generation growing suspicious of authority. But this anthem didn't start in a jail cell or a garage. It started with a songwriter shaped by Buddy Holly. Sonny Curtis of the Crickets, Buddy Holly's original backing band, wrote the song in 1959. His version was crisp, clean, and had that unmistakable rockabilly edge. The lyrics were inspired by a real story of a man who committed a robbery to help pay for medical bills. The song wasn't about recklessness, it was about the cost of desperation. But it stayed under the radar, tucked away as an album track that few noticed. 7 years later, Bobby Fuller picked it up and transformed it into something punchier. His voice carried a kind of weary defiance, like he knew he was going down but refused to apologize. The beat was sharper, the guitar riffs grittier, and suddenly the song sounded like an anthem. A few months after the song's release, Fuller was found dead in his car under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but few believed that. The song became his legacy, overshadowing its origins and locking Bobby Fuller into rock history forever. Most listeners never realized the voice they were hearing wasn't the first to sing those words. They just heard the law and the man who dared to fight Ivan if he lost. There are songs that tell a story, and then there's House of the Rising Sunday. When the Animals released their version in 1964, they turned a centuries-old ballad into a haunting rock opera. That arpeggiated guitar intro, Eric Burdon's chilling vocalset, sounded like a ghost confessing sins over a whiskey-soaked piano. But the song's journey started long before London or radio. The roots of House of the Rising Sunday stretch back through American folk traditions. Lead Belly sang it. Bob Dylan recorded it. It was passed from voice to voice, reshaped every time it was sung, sometimes by men, sometimes by women. Sometimes it was about gambling, other times about prostitution. The house, the sin, the ruin, they were constants. But no one could trace it to a single writer. It belonged to the people. The Animals didn't just cover it, they reinvented it for the electric age. They took a traditional folk song and gave it a pulse. The track ran over 4 minutes long, unthinkable for radio at the time, but it still reached #1. Burton's delivery wasn't theatrical, it was personal. It felt like he had been to the house. Like he had lost something there he'd never get back. It's a song that defies time. Most fans think the Animals wrote it, and in a way, they did write its final form. But buried beneath the distortion and organ lies an old American warning, whispered for generations before the world ever heard it scream. If rock and roll had a national anthem, it might just be Louie Louie. That slurred vocal, the offbeat rhythm, the three-chord simplicity, it sounds like it was invented in a garage, because it basically was. The Kingsmen's 1963 version lit a fire that would influence punk, garage rock, and a whole generation of misfits. But it wasn't born in the back of a dive bar. It started with calypso roots. Richard Berry wrote and recorded the original Louie Louie in 1957, inspired by a Caribbean rhythm he heard called El Loco Cha-Cha. His version was smoother, slower, with a clearly sung story about a homesick sailor longing for his girl. It was catchy, yes, but it didn't explode. It quietly influenced musicians from the West Coast and beyond, until one scrappy group from Portland took it somewhere unexpected. The Kingsmen weren't exactly polished. During their one-take recording, the singer Jack Ely stood too far from the mic, creating the now iconic, unintelligible lyrics. The result sounded like chaos, but it worked. Teenagers loved it, parents panicked, and the government launched an investigation into the lyrics, convinced they were obscene. The truth? They weren't. No one could understand a thing. That accidental magic made Louie Louie immortal. It wasn't the song itself, it was the feeling. And for all its fame, most people never knew it started as a calypso ballad by a black songwriter with a story worth hearing. The Kingsmen gave it grit, but Berry gave it soul.
Got a black magic woman.
When Carlos Santana unleashed Black Magic Woman in 1970, it didn't just sound new, it sounded supernatural. The fusion of Latin percussion, blues guitar, and electric mysticism felt like a spell. Santana's solos soared over a rhythm that pulsed like blood, and his name became forever linked to the track. But the song didn't begin in San Francisco, or even in Latin rock. It began in the British blues scene. 2 years earlier, Fleetwood Mac's That Fleetwood Mac recorded the original version written by guitarist Peter Green. His take was stripped down, moody, and bluesy, with a subtle kind of sorrow laced into every note. It was a pure blues confession, not yet the sensual storm Santana would create. Green's guitar work was brilliant but restrained. The world wasn't readier, perhaps it just wasn't listening. When Santana got hold of the song, everything changed. He expanded it, added congas, extended the solos, and blended it seamlessly with Gypsy Queen by Gabber Sabot. It was no longer a blues lament, it became a hypnotic trance. Santana didn't just play the song, he summoned it. He transformed Peter Green's shadow into a flame that burned across continents and generations. Most fans never knew Fleetwood Mac had anything to do with it. Santana's version eclipsed the original so completely that it became his signature. But deep beneath the congas and feedback, Peter Green's ghost still lingers, whispering the first line of that spell. Rollin', rollin', rollin' on the river. Those words are forever etched into rock history, but depending on who you ask, they come with a different voice. Creedence Clearwater Revival released Proud Mary in 1969, blending swampy southern imagery with John Fogerty's sharp vocals. It was gritty, grounded, and felt like a postcard from the Mississippi. But a year later, the song exploded into something else entirely. Ike and Tina Turner reimagined Proud Mary as a soul rock explosion. They took the easygoing rhythm of the original and flipped it. It started soft, then hit like lightning pure gospel, funk, and fire. Tina didn't just sing the lyrics, she lived them. Her voice roared with power, and the arrangement turned riverboats into freight trains. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was a show. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like two entirely different tracks. Fogerty's original was contemplative and restrained. Tina's version was a revolution. The Turners didn't just cover the song, they claimed it. For many, their rendition became the definitive version, overshadowing the original in both emotion and energy. Today, both versions are classics, but only one made people sweat on the dance floor and feel like they were rolling with Tina herself. When Proud Mary rolls down the river, it carries two very different legacies. When Jimi Hendrix released All Along the Watchtower in 1968, it didn't sound like a cover, it sounded like prophecy. That intro guitar riff cracked open the sky, and Hendrix's voice carried something apocalyptic. It felt urgent, cryptic, and revolutionary. But the words weren't his. They belonged to Bob Dylan. Dylan wrote the song in 1967 for his album John Wesley Harding. His version was acoustic, minimal, and full of mystery. The lyrics sounded like scripture haunting, poetic, loaded with meaning, but the music was subdued, almost secondary to the words. It felt like the kind of tune you'd hear whispered through a crackling radio late at night. Then Hendrix took it and set it on fire. He layered electric guitars, reimagined the pacing, and made the song breathe. Dylan's poetry suddenly had muscle. Hendrix's interpretation was so powerful that Dylan himself started performing his song in Jimi's style. That's how deep the transformation ran. Even the original artist bowed to the cover. When people think of All Along the Watchtower, they don't think of harmonicas or acoustic guitars. They hear that storm of feedback, that cry of electric anguish. And most never realize they're hearing a Dylan song hidden beneath a Hendrix masterpiece.
Been dazed and confused.
When Led Zeppelin unleashed Dazed and Confused on their debut album in 1969, it sounded like nothing anyone had heard before. Dark, sludgy, and hypnotic, the song became one of their most iconic tracks. Jimmy Page's bowed guitar solo, Robert Plant's wailing vocalset, was psychedelic blues taken to cosmic extremes. But the song wasn't theirs. Not originally. 2 years earlier, a singer-songwriter named Jake Holmes had recorded a much quieter, folk rock version of the same song. His Dazed and Confused was brooding and introspective, built on a descending bass line and lyrical anxiety. When Holmes opened for the Yardbirds in New York, Page heard it and took it back to England. The band experimented with it live, and after Zeppelin formed, they reworked it entirely without crediting Holmes. It wasn't until decades later that Holmes took legal action and finally received acknowledgement. But by then, Zeppelin's version had already been etched into rock legend. What started as a haunting folk confession had evolved into a monster of blues rock energy. For years, fans thought it was pure Zeppelin genius, but the bones of it belonged to someone else. Summertime Blues started off as a teen anthem about summer jobs and no car. Eddie Cochran released it in 1958 with a rockabilly swing, simple and catchy, full of teenage frustration. It was the kind of song that played at diners and high school dances. Then, 10 years later, Blue Cheer came along and completely detonated it. Their version, released in 1968, was a wall of noise. Distortion, volume, and pounding drums turned this modest tune into a proto-metal earthquake. Blue Cheer, often cited as one of the loudest bands of the time, took Cochran's words and layered them over fuzzed-out guitars that felt like the earth splitting open. It wasn't about chores anymore, it was about rebellion at full blast. Few fans connected the two versions. Blue Cheer's Summertime Blues felt like it had always belonged to the acid-fueled chaos of the late 60s. But underneath the noise, the spirit of Cochran's song was still there, just warped by time, technology, and a new generation that refused to be polite. Eric Clapton made Crossroads a rock staple, but the road began far from electric guitars. Robert Johnson recorded Crossroad Blues in 1936, just a man and a guitar, pouring out fear and fate in a hotel room in Texas. His lyrics told of a man stuck at the edge of salvation, maybe bargaining with the devil. It was haunting, stripped down, and undeniably raw. Cream's 1968 version reimagined the blues for a louder, faster world. Clapton's searing solos and the band's thunderous rhythm section transformed Johnson's spiritual struggle into a rock battlefield. Suddenly, the Crossroads weren't just metaphorical, they were on fire. The band played it live with such ferocity that it became a showcase for Clapton's guitar heroism, a blues tradition reborn through Marshall amps. The blues roots remain barely. Most listeners never knew the version they love was built on Delta dirt, not London clubs. But Clapton always credited Johnson, acknowledging that without those early ghosts, there'd be no modern blues rock. In a way, every riff still echoes back to that old recording in a makeshift studio nearly a century ago.
I hurt myself.
When Johnny Cash released Hurt in 2002, it didn't sound like a cover, it sounded like a final confession. That weathered voice, the sparse piano, the cracked emotion it stopped time. It was the sound of a man confronting every wound, every regret, and turning it into truth. Many believed it was his original song, written in the twilight of his life, but it wasn't. The pain began somewhere else.
Upon my
9 Inch Nails released the original in 1994. Trent Reznor wrote it as the closing track on The Downward Spiral, an industrial rock meditation on self-destruction. His version was bleak, metallic, full of angst and electronic noise. It was a young man screaming from the edge. When Cash covered it, he turned that scream into a whispering, somehow made it even more devastating. Even Reznor was shaken. He later said the song no longer belonged to him. In Cash's hands, Hurt became a eulogy, a legacy, a moment of complete artistic surrender. It closed not just an album, but a life. When people hear Hurt today, they think of Cash, but behind that final performance lies another voice, another era, another truth rewritten in the language of pain and guitars. Some songs become more than just recordings. They become echoes of other voices, other lives, echoes that travel through time disguised as something new. These 10 covers didn't just reinterpret rock, they reshaped its memory. Behind every guitar riff you've memorized, there might be a name history almost forgot. What if your favorite song belonged to someone else? Hit subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth behind the music, the legends, and the myths that shaped rock history. Because the past isn't always what it seems, and neither are the songs we thought we knew.